Hi, I'm Pastor Harry Zanting, one of the pastors in the First Christian Reformed Church in Red Deer, Alberta. This series of teaching videos on the Ten Commandments rose out of an adult education class at our Foundations Night that began in the fall of 2020. But because of COVID restrictions, which have changed our lives in many ways, we were unable to continue in person. But we can continue to learn and reflect on the Ten Commandments in this way. Almost all of the videos are recorded in my living room, and for a reason. The Ten Commandments are not just rules handed down to make life a burden and difficult. They are meant for everyday life, and they give us guidance on how to live life well with each other, with the creation, and with God. It is how everyday life is meant to be lived. And when we follow these words from God, our lives thrive and our relationships thrive. With that, let's take up the next commandment. Well, welcome as we continue our series on the Ten Commandments. And we are on the 8th commandment, you shall not steal. Well, let me begin by noting that there is a lot of interaction and connectedness between the last 3 commandments. Stealing often involves lying and deception, false witness. Patrick Miller says the Hebrew word for stealing means to take from another and to do so by stealth, that is, undercover. And that's where deceit comes in. And what is the motivation for stealing? The 10th commandment talks about coveting. Again, it's not just an outward action, but it has to do with the heart and the thoughts of a person. You shall not steal. It's it's short, that command, but it's not very specific. There's no object. Steal what? Money, as I kind of suggested here? Well, the 6th commandment talks about, if we're looking at the last table of the law, the 6th commandment talks about a neighbor's life, the 7th about his wife, the 8th about his things and possessions. But now the rabbis considered this commandment about stealing to be actually about kidnapping and stealing people, while the command on coveting was more about taking people's things. So this one is about stealing a neighbor's life. Not murdering, but just stealing their life. So Joseph in the book of Genesis might be an example when his brothers sold him into slavery, right? They stole his life for some money. Now, you might think, well, then it doesn't really apply that much to us because kidnapping and slavery is not a big problem today. Or is it? When you think of sweatshops or prostitution where women are forced to do that, or war and its effects, I think there's more of it going on than you might think. But since the command has no specific object, it does open it up quite a bit. It can include things, land, people, lives. In Exodus, when later in the book it deals with theft, and it deals with the theft of those things necessary for one's livelihood. That's kind of a key element. There, if you steal an ox or a donkey, you might include tools or even withholding those things that can allow people to provide for themselves, that will allow people to work. If we withhold them, if we steal those, even food and clothing, which we need to survive. And it even covers things that are borrowed and our responsibility for them. If you wreck something you've borrowed or it gets stolen from you, it's as if you have stolen. Or even Exodus deals with this. If we find a neighbor's things, find his ox on the road or something. We are to keep that animal safe until we find an opportunity to give it back to them. And if we don't do that, we steal from them. And then there's also stealing from God. Now, the Catechism works to spell that out in practical terms. Lord's Day 42, question and answer 110. What does God forbid in the 8th commandment? God forbids not only outright theft and robbery, punishable by law, but in God's sight, theft also includes all scheming and swindling in order to get our neighbor's goods for ourselves, whether by force or means that appear legitimate, such as inaccurate measures of weight, size, or volume, fraudulent merchandising, counterfeit money, excessive interest, or any other means forbidden by God. In addition, God forbids all greed and pointless squandering of his gifts. All right, you can see where the 9th commandment is there about scheming and appearances and fraudulence and counterfeit. There's a lot of that. There's this drawing that I think it shows it kind of humorously, but it's from 1936, Tipping the Scales by Leslie Thrasher. There's the butcher with his finger on the scale and the woman with her finger under the scale, and each of them stealing, I suppose. This commandment calls for us to be honest. Now that sounds easy, but our society has become so complex that it's no longer clear what constitutes stealing. Think of accounting procedures that have become so complicated and we can maneuver them in certain ways. I think about copyright laws even. Is that stealing? Government handouts for COVID and there's a lot of questionable stuff there. Is it stealing? I know some Christian schools that were taken to task by Canada Revenue having to do with tuition and taxes. There's so much dishonesty out there, we hardly know what is true or what is honest. Fudging with numbers, it happens all the time. We make proper numbers to support a certain thing. They may be very accurate, but advertising does that all the time. I think of packaging to make things look bigger or like there's more than there is. Anyway, it talks about excessive interest in the Catechism there. Exodus 22 verse 25 says, if you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not be like a moneylender. Charge him no interest. Oh, now, we could still charge interest. In fact, Jesus tells a parable where he tells the person you should have given that so you at least gotten interest for that talent. But for the needy, who need help, it would be stealing. We are withholding the means by which someone can make a livelihood. It also talks in the Catechism there about the squandering of gifts. Well, there we're dealing with a topic of stewardship. Psalm 24 verse 1 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. God, it belongs to God. God gives it to us to take care of it. And if we squander, neglect, misuse, wreck it, then we do not let it be used to its potential, which would benefit people, which would benefit our neighbors and the common good. And then we're stealing from them. And the Catechism talks about forbidding all greed. Well, there we're dealing with the heart or motivation for stealing. We want it for ourselves and we will take it from others. And here again, we are interacting with the 10th commandment, the underlying heart and thoughts. Now that, of course, when in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus deals with the underlying heart and thoughts of a number of the commandments, but notably he does not address this command in the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, Jesus hardly deals with the 8th commandment at all. In Luke 12:13 and following, there's the story where someone comes to him from the crowd and says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now it seems like there's something going on, some stealing maybe. And Jesus just shoves it off. It says, Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" In fact, Jesus is more concerned with the poor. And he's more concerned with the dangers of wealth. One of his sayings is, "No one can serve both God and mammon," another word for money. Joan Chittister, now I like what she says about all this. She says, "We presume that the function of criminal law is to protect the property of the rich from the greed of the poor. Israel, on the other hand, presumed that the function of this commandment was to protect the common property of the clan, the water well, the grazing land, the sheep, from being expropriated by the individual for the sake of personal profit." Whew. "You shall not steal" has been reduced to mean no shoplifting, no pilfering, no pickpocketing, no burglary, no petty theft. And it has become the province of the poor people, sick people, immature people. And notice that those crimes that I just mentioned are mostly the crimes of the poor. Chittister goes on to say, but the stealing the Decalogue really has in mind, is really concerned about, has actually become the sin of rich people, powerful people, people in position to say, take it or leave it, to those who seek a living wage or subsidized housing or medical benefits and pensions. The rich gather it up, hoard it, and then control it so others can't get it. They gather more than they need and then keep others from getting what they need. Here's an example with some figures. CEOs of companies, their wages compared to their workers. And this is US figures. In 1980, the CEO's wages were 42 times greater than their workers. 10 years later, in 1990, they were 85 times greater. 10 years later still, 2000, they were 531 times greater. Whoa, wow. Here's another figure. In 1998, the world's 225 richest people's annual income was equal to that of 2.5 billion of the poorest. Chittister says, there's another kind of stealing we don't want to talk about. This kind involves having more than we need and giving nothing to those who don't have anything. This kind steals by consuming, controlling, hoarding all the goods of the earth for oneself. We call it rugged individualism. Don't be fooled. It is spiritual gluttony. And you know, that's the heart of capitalism, of consumerism, of materialism. And you know, most of us are quite entrenched in those. What does it say about the way the rich are able to avoid paying taxes? It's just another side issue, I guess. The rich are able to avoid paying taxes. Now, tax money is meant to help all the people. It's for the common good. I know there's corruption in the government and all that kind of stuff, but it is collected for the common good. And yet the rich avoid paying taxes. And you think they're more generous? They are not. Percentage-wise, they give less than the poor. Anyway, Chittister also says this: stealing is not about things. Stealing is about relationships. Loving your neighbor, that's the summary of this second table of the law, this section, right? It is a social sin, stealing, which impacts the community. How so, you might ask? Well, it breaks trust, it raises prices, it causes losses, it brings poverty. Let's use Jacob as an example from the Bible. He's known as the deceiver, right? He steals the birthright and the blessing from his brother. There's all kinds of deception with his father-in-law, right? When it comes to wages and sheep. But you know, if you read the story, it doesn't just impact Jacob. It draws in his whole family. So Esau is angry and bitter. Laban competes in stealing. His wife ends up stealing the family idols. It impacts everybody. Here's another example. In Joshua 7, Achan steals what was supposed to be devoted to God, right? They had run over Jericho and all that was supposed to be given to God, but Achan takes some. And the impact it has on the community. So right after that, they go to a battle at a place which they should easily have won, but they lose and people die because Achan has stolen. So it impacts the thief, it impacts the victim, and it impacts the community. Well, then how do we respond to stealing? How do we deal with greed and stifle stealing? Take note, I know that's over a period of time, or a section of Scripture there, but in Exodus and also in Deuteronomy, when they expand on the 8th commandment, they deal extensively with restitution and restoration as a response to stealing. Judgment involves people paying back, restoring, and often more than what was stolen, because it's not just the object stolen, but all the other damage that it causes. Which I think might be something that our justice system could do more with, rather than simply punishing someone, sending them to jail. Restorative justice. So that's one way of responding to stealing. In the New Testament, in Ephesians 4:28, it says this: He who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work doing something useful with his own hands, that he may have something to share with those in need. Work and honest labor makes us better people. It provides for us, for ourselves. So it don't just stop stealing, but replace it with something worthwhile, with what we are created to do, to work. And then to share with those in need. That's good stewardship, to share the extra with others. Well, back to the Catechism. Question and answer 111 asks, what does God require of you in this commandment? And this is the answer: that I do whatever I can for my neighbor's good, that I treat others as I would like them to treat me, and that I work faithfully so that I may share with those in need. You might notice the allusion to the golden rule. Luke 6, verse 31, that's where you find it. Do to others as you would have them do to me. Stealing harms the neighbor, but working and generosity helps the neighbor, and we all benefit as a community. Now, Paul writes, going to another aspect, Paul writes in 1 Timothy 6, verse 6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Be content. Contentment. It's a cure for coveting and greed. When you're content, you don't desire those things anymore. Having said that, to be content is probably a gift that we need to ask God for. Now, Paul goes on in 1 Timothy 6, verse 9, to say, people who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. It tells us again that about the social aspect of stealing. Money become an idol, and we cannot serve both God and money. Stealing reveals what we think has value. It reveals where our treasure is, but in the end, it gives us nothing, certainly not life. Paul goes on in 1 Timothy 6, verse 17 to say, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. God does richly provide so that we can enjoy, but also so that we can be generous. Giving, generosity, is a way to stifle greed. It's a way to free its lecherous hold on us. It's a way to honor God and to deepen our faith and trust in God. Well, that's it. A very short command, a very concise command, but there's more to it when you start to delve into it. Thank you for listening, and take care.